So this is my legal slide. Just cover my bases. Nobody wants to hear the legal jargon, so I put a meme up there for you. Yeah, all the prices are made up. Nothing to do with Wayne Sanderson actual feed costs or ingredient costs or anything like that. No wages or anything like that. So I covered it. All right, we're looking at the patent for the toilet paper roll. So basically, you guys heard all the cool stuff already. So there's people out there probably have strong preference whether the toilet paper comes over the top or the bottom, right? And if you have a preference, you're very strongly opinionated about it. So basically, you heard all the cool stuff. So this is basically just a different take on all the same stuff. It's just a different presentation. Also, if you think the toilet paper is supposed to come from the bottom like my wife, U.S. patent says you're wrong. So, we've talked a lot of really cool stuff. So what's a limiting amino acid? So if we just jump in, amino acids, we're looking at just the quintessential, essential, indispensable versus your non-essential. So most of the formulation, until we get way into the weeds like Marcelo's doing in Avogen, primarily a lot of this formulation is just going to occur with the essential amino acids. Non-essential, typically we're going to be pretty far above until we get really low into crude protein, and then we're going to start having to look at that. And then we also see that what we sometimes classify as non-essential, we can run into what would be a semi-essential or a rate limiting for these non-essential amino acids. So just using the barrel stave, kind of like Marcelo did, when we're talking about limiting amino acids. So if we just say each barrel stave is an amino acid, that dark purple one at the bottom, that's shortest, is going to be your methionine. And then we have other essentials that are built above. So the water in that barrel represents what protein synthesis can occur. And so obviously methionine is going to be the shortest. The bird is only going to be able to do protein synthesis to the point where it's first limiting amino acid. So in this case, methionine is going to be your first. So that's going to be your typical bird. So we go back to the question, what's a limiting amino acid? Well, if we look at it from a physiological standpoint, and this probably isn't the best wording, but it's basically going to be what's the amino acid that's the lowest or furthest from its requirement to achieve what we want to do. If we talk about it from a formulation standpoint, it really comes down to like a cost pressure point. So if we go back to the barrel stave concept, if we want to raise methionine, we got two options. We can either use intact protein, so a soybean meal or any of these other ones, or we can use a synthetic. If we use the concept of just using an intact, like a soybean meal, it's not going to work out real well. Methionine and cysteine are pretty low relative to a lot of the other amino acids in soybean meal. So we'll also be proportionally raising the other amino acids. So we can raise the methionine, we can raise what that bird can potentially do, but we're also creating a greater waste because all those amino acids above that water level, the bird has to figure out what to do with. But if we bring in synthetic methionine, we can basically double what we're doing for protein synthesis, and we're also reducing the amount of wastage we have. So if we look at order of limitation, and this is top three are probably going to be 99% of the time. It's going to be your methionine, which we're formulating back to more of a sulfur amino acid combination. Your lysine is going to be second, threonine is going to be third. Once you get to that point, it gets a little convoluted because it's going to depend on what our ingredient mix is. So probably in U.S. diets, most of the time, valine is going to be fourth, especially in all veg diets. We can get into situations where isoleucine can become fourth, particularly later phase birds that have a lot of animal protein in there. Arginine, if we're using a lot of corn byproduct, DDGs or something like that, arginine can come in as one of those and could be co-limiting with those two. And as we just keep working down, we can run into a whole lot of different limiting amino acids. So Dr. Kidd, he did a pretty cool paper. I mean, it's just basically kind of a history. And so we're looking at a lot of different things here, but we start in the 50s, we have linear programming, so least cost formulation comes into effect. And we also see the first time methionine is really used in any poultry diets. So you're asking, what in the world does linear programming have to do with limiting amino acids? So if we take a 100,000-foot view of linear programming or least cost formulation, basically all it's doing is saying we're going to optimize. We're going to find the lowest cost of feed we can find using constraints. So we're saying, hey, we want this protein, we want this energy. Here's your corn, here's your soybean meal, and we have protein and energy for both of those. So linear programming, all it's doing is shooting some lines. So we end up with this feasible region. So any combination of corn and soy within that feasible region is going to meet the constraints that we have. So linear program is basically going to take and find those vertices, and it's going to calculate the lowest cost that it can. So we're optimizing lowest cost based on constraints. And so Hutton in 58 printed all these formulas using linear programming, and methionine was used, which was kind of outside the box at the time, because it was funny because the cost per ton of feed was like $75 for the whole ton. And methionine was $2.50 a pound, so pretty high. So there was a little bit of turmoil saying that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but if you follow the math makes, it doesn't know what to do. It finds the cheapest cost. The other thing was a lot of the research before that was just based off of crude protein. So a lot of the research showed higher crude protein, better bird performance. So we start using methionine, we start dropping crude protein. Well, the other concept was there wasn't a lot of ideas around balancing amino acids at that time also. So there was a little bit of a turmoil around that, but eventually took off. You also see there's a lot of, and I summarized it for Dr. Kidd, it just says computer stuff. So right now, I mean, we're walking around and there's computers in our pockets. There wasn't a whole lot of computers back in the 50s and 60s. So as computers began to get better, faster, we start seeing, and we're using linear programming, we start seeing more of these synthetics come in. We're using least cost formulation. So we see lysine come in the 70s and 80s, threonine, 90s, probably early 2000s, commercial adoption. 2000s, more computer stuff. I could have wrote it, Dr. Kidd, for you. And then it's funny, whenever you look at it, it took almost 50 years to really take off on 3 of the biggest synthetics to hit the first 3 limiting amino acids. And really within the last 10 years, we've seen commercially probably an additional 4 synthetics come in. So it's been pretty neat just to see it. To kind of wrap up the whole idea, we have digestibility coefficients, so we're doing more towards what the bird can actually get from an ingredient, so quality, not quantity. And then we're balancing how those amino acids are. So if we go back to that barrel stave concept, we can set up our lysine, and we can basically try to take the top out of any excess. So we can set up a specific plane that we would like to do using these balanced protein concept. I'm just going to kind of jump through some of these limiting ones. Get a drink of water. I'm going to jump methionine and lysine and just go to threonine. So threonine, third limiting amino acid, pretty functional amino acid that's really important for enteric health. Has a very high requirement of maintenance when you start talking about mucin and intestinal support. Major component of mucin, anything that threonine goes into mucin production, basically the bird is not getting that back. We also see IgA, which is really important for intestinal homeostasis. Again, another portion that's going to be lost. So anything that's really putting a demand on enteric health should raise threonine requirements. And so there's a few papers out there that show that. Corzo in 2007 titrated threonine over new and built-up litter and showed a quadratic response for both body weight gain and breast meat yield. Requirement for new was actually 0.73, which I believe that ratio back to lysine came out to like a 63. And then on built up, we see a few points higher, so that ratio actually ends up about almost a 67. And so we see the same thing on breast meat yield. So obviously there's an environmental challenge that occurs. It's going to increase our threonine requirement. And then we look at a more recent one using the subclinical NE model. Again, 67 promoted much better growth than the 63. Another thing to look at, we know there's an age effect. So we're always saying get birds off to a good start. We don't want to physiologically put a bird into a limiting amino acid on something we can supplement pretty easy. So we know that looking here, corn and soy, we see a pretty substantial difference between a 10-day-old digestibility coefficient and a 22-day-old bird. So if you just took a starter diet at like 65% corn and 30% soybean meal, and you formulated that at a 65 ratio, just the difference in these two digestibility coefficients, you end up at a 63. And then we add in a Coxie challenge. Both of these are Sam's papers, different papers. But looking at the top, we have this is a parent digestibility for threonine over a varying amount of acervulina challenge. And we see a linear drop in digestibility. And then he has the lysine or the threonine deletion here. So not only do we have a 28% drop from our unchallenged control, we also have a 28% drop if we have an infected. So that's a pretty big drop. I mean, it's almost 55% from where we could have been. So the point is, we can formulate it at a 65, but really is the bird seeing a 65? And really, should we potentially go higher if we know we got built-up litter, we're putting it on a vaccine for Coxie, and we have young birds? So this is just kind of playing with some formulas. I hadn't run one without threonine in a long time. So this is all, again, hypothetical, kind of a grower-finisher formula. So just setting it up. So corn, soy, I think I used Amino Dat 5 from Evonik just to kind of set up the amino acids. Meat and bone meal fat would just be normal specs. So what we have without threonine coming in synthetic, we have 22.5% protein. We're hitting our sulfurs and our threonine, but you see we have valine and iso quite a bit over what we would spec. These two random numbers over here is going to be how much the synthetics are contributing to that specific amino acid. So methionine coming in synthetics saying 33.8% of the dietary digestible sulfurs, and then lysine is only 2.1. And then we bring in threonine, and this is typically going to be what's going to happen whenever we're this high up on the chain. More corn, less soy, less fat. We're going to drop our crude protein quite a bit. We've reduced some excess on valine and iso, and probably further down the chain. But we also see a higher contribution coming in from synthetics. Going to branch chains, I just kept all three of them together because I think at this point we kind of got to keep them all together just because of all the interaction that occurs. So pretty early research showed that there was an interactive effect between all three of these amino acids, and particularly whenever we got leucine really high. And that's because of the whole chain of degradation. And leucine, if we get leucine really high, it's going to go ahead and start the chain, and it is non-discriminatory. It's going to find whatever branch chain it wants and take it down. And once it's gone, it's gone. So we can have an imbalance here that occurs and actually create a deficiency if we don't look at all three of them together. Maynard, so this is a 2022 COB 500, just looking at 28 to 42 days, formulated a low and a high leucine level, so 115 versus 145. Solid line is going to be your 115, dotted is going to be your high. So we see some different curves occurring for body weight and feed conversion. And we also see that the optimum valine to achieve the greatest body weight or best feed conversion is going to be quite a bit higher on a higher leucine diet than it is for a low leucine diet. This one here, using central composite design, Criseldi 22 publication, we see very similar stuff. So at a 110, we're seeing, in order to optimize feed conversion, valine at 79, ISO at 65. We run leucine higher. We got to move valine and isoleucine to be able to reach that optimum. And the other thing to point out is, look at the worst whenever we go to high leucine. We can be much worse than whenever we're at low. And then looking here, this same paper, we see that as leucine increases, so this is going to be your body weight, 110, 190, we see the maximum actually moves up to the top right. So in order to achieve that maximum, we have to be adjusting our valine and isoleucine. So what I did here, again, this is just kind of what I did with threonine, or letting threonine come in synthetically. So we look at it again, we see more corn, a lot less soy, a lot less fat. We see a whole lot more contribution coming in from our synthetics, and we see our crude protein drop. Another thing that happens to pay attention to is whenever this occurs, we're also dropping our leucine, and a lot of the papers show optimum leucine is going to be as close to 110 as you can get it. So if we're dropping leucine, that's going to be a positive. We're also rebalancing ISO in this particular point. So we're just kind of balancing out these branch chains on both these different diets. So one thing I like to look at, so if my grain buyer comes by and goes, hey, I can get a really good buy on corn gluten meal. This is the price. Well, if we just least cost formulate that bad boy, say, yeah, we can use 3% and save $2. But if we don't go back and say, man, raise my leucine from a 135 to a 150, I got to adjust my valine and ISO. Really, my cost savings shouldn't be $2. It's probably like 50 cents, just because of the additional cost that we have to do to rebalance those ISO and valine. So just another way to think about some of these ingredients whenever we're looking at trying to save costs and keep the same performance. Arginine. Man, thank goodness Sam went in front of me. So, yeah, like he said, very multifunctional, a lot of stuff going on there. I won't spend a whole lot of time in there because I'm pretty sure he got it. One thing, so Avagen, Corzo published this in 21, looking at arginine titration. They were thinking, hey, man, all the genetics have changed. We need to see what the arginine is, especially since we're starting to see more of these branch change use synthetically in commercial diets. So 2 different experiments on YPM 708s. We see from 0 to 14 pretty much kind of falls in with what we historically would think, around that 105 area for optimum on your feed conversion. Once we get out older, though, we're out to 116, so that's quite a bit different than what the historical 105 would say. And then we also, interestingly, saw a linear increase in thigh weight and yield with increasing arginine. So another thing we consider whenever we're looking at arginine is immunity impact. Again, Sam nailed that one. So, but we saw a definite immunity impact, and we see a heat stress impact as well. Particularly looking at, I think there was a linear response at 46 days for body temp. And we also see a linear improvement during the heat stress phase and feed conversion. So if we're thinking, historically, we've been 105. we really haven't been touching it because we haven't had the cost to be able to do, valine, isoleucine, and really even get down to the 105 on arginine unless we have a different ingredient mix with a lot of DDGs or something. So it really hasn't been a big pressure point for formulation. But as we're looking at a lot of the new information, should we be running higher in commercial diets? I don't have a whole lot on glycine. I think Marcelo covered quite a bit of that, but pretty important. Typically, I think there's a lot of different ways that people look at glycine. Glycine plus serine is kind of the way I look at it. And that's typically just a total glycine plus serine back to maybe a digestible lysine level, so a ratio there, or just looking at it relative as a total. There is some glycine equivalency numbers out there for research, but basically, whenever we start doing these all-veg diets and you start looking at this glycine serine level, relative to what you see in a lot of literature, it can get pretty low. And there's a lot of different research out there, and I think right now, I think Marcelo and those guys, I think they're getting a good hold on it, but right before that, it was a lot of different yes, no, yes, maybe, it's this level, it's that level. So we know it's important, just got to try to tack that one down. So commercially, what's the advantages of continuing to move down the chain in terms of limiting amino acids and synthetic use? First of all, cost savings for me. If we go back to that diet, those diets that was published by Lee in 2020, what I did, so there's a high input cost and there would be a current one. The current one was current 2.5 weeks ago before the board fell out. So the high would be something similar to what we had last year. And I think I used about $10 corn, $5.50 soy, 1,200 fat, and I can't remember what it did on meat and bone meal, but it was pretty high. So just by introducing valine and isoleucine in just a corn soy meal diet, that's almost $6.50 savings per ton. And with the animal meat and bone meal, almost $4 per ton savings. And then we go a current, and I think I was using about a $5 corn at that time and about $3.75 soy. Again, we still see a $4 savings and a $2 savings based on those different formulas. Another thing you see reduction in nitrogen and your amino acid balancing. So in that particular trial, no difference in body weight or feed conversion. We did see an improvement or an increase in feed intake, but we also saw a decrease in nitrogen intake by almost 6.5%. So I skipped methionine again, so 2, 3, 4 limiting amino acids. Since we're hitting those already on the formulation, we actually saw an increase because the feed intake went up. But we also saw that ISO dropped by 2.5%, arginine almost 8.5%, and then trip. So as we went down further the line, we saw more decrease in what those amino acids. So if we go back to the barrel, we're reducing our waste. In that same trial, and it pretty much agrees with almost any other published research, is nitrogen decreases, your litter nitrogen decreases. And the other thing that occurs, I can't remember who was talking about it, but whenever you're decreasing crude protein, you see a decrease in water consumption. So they did see a numerical decrease in litter moisture. So essentially, you're setting that bird up for a better litter quality. So the potential for paw quality is going to be much better. Another thing that I like is the soybean meal reduction. I'm the 100%, that's pretty good. So why do we take soybean meal? It's probably the best protein source we have, especially in the U.S. And so if you look at it for broilers, you have a lot of indigestible oligosaccharides, so your raffinose stachyose. You also have some trypsin inhibitor possibility. And the one thing I really like is you're potentially reducing your variability. So if we went back and we looked at some of those formulas where we were introducing more synthetics, and we're talking about how much contribution you have coming from synthetics for those limiting amino acids, we know that's pretty much fixed. A 55% lysine is going to be at least 55% lysine. If we start looking at soybean meal, and if we have two different suppliers coming into a mill, we may have 1.5% standard deviation. We're taking a safety margin, but that standard deviation is still there, so there's a lot of fluctuation in protein. Also, if you go back and look, a 47% protein does not mean that everything in lysine is exactly the same. So we probably have another 10 to 20 points variation just on lysine. So we start multiplying variation on top of variation. So by using more synthetics, we can reduce that variability and kind of hone in more what that bird's actually seeing. The other thing we see, and it was just kind of by accident, didn't even think about it, we started using valine at 1 mil. And their PDIs jumped like 8%. So I asked, I was like, what'd you guys do? They go, we just put in valine. So we went through a lot of those formulas. We see a big reduction in added fat. So if you're putting a lot of fat in the mixer, taking that out, it's going to definitely help pellet quality. And if you go back to what Teeter did at Oklahoma State, there's a lot of value in having some pellets. Some of the problems going down the line, we just got to keep learning what's next. So glycine, serine, histidine, phenylalanine, what's our non-essential amino acid, nitrogen. So we just got to keep going. I think there's a sense of, if I keep doing that, I'm going to lose performance. So I think there's maybe some hesitation there, and increased fat pad. And I know Marcelo talked about that too. And I think we have some trials coming up just looking at, is there a difference in net energy as we continue to drop crude protein? All right. Thank y'all.